I watched the monitor display her oxygen saturation, 96%, normal, steady. Her chest rose and fell in perfect rhythm as the ventilator did its work. I documented it in the chart at 3:47 a.m. Patient breathing adequately, vitals stable, no distress noted. I signed my name, Ashley Mitchell, RN, and moved on to the next patient. That was 7 days ago. Now I'm sitting in a hospital conference room with hospital administration, the state medical board, and a lawyer I can't afford. And everything I said about that night is being treated like a crime. The detective across from me leans forward, his notebook open, and asks the same question for the 5th time. Ms. Mitchell, you reported that the patient was breathing. You documented it. But the autopsy showed... I can't hear the rest. My hands are shaking so badly I have to sit on them. Let me back up. Let me tell you about before all this happened, because that's the only way any of this makes sense. 3 months earlier, everything was normal. Perfect, even. I'd been a registered nurse for 8 years at Riverside Medical Center, a mid-sized suburban hospital in Ohio. I wasn't famous or anything, just good at my job. The kind of nurse patients remembered. The kind who actually listened. My colleagues respected me. My paycheck wasn't huge, but it was steady, and I'd managed to save almost $30,000. I had a 1-bedroom apartment with a view of the parking lot, which wasn't much, but it was mine. My mom called every Sunday at 6 o'clock. We'd talk for exactly 45 minutes about her bridge club, her neighbors, and why I still wasn't married. "You're 34, Ashley," she'd say. "Your window is closing." I'd laugh it off, but there was a part of me that worried she was right. My best friend Jennifer worked in the pediatric ward. We'd grab lunch together most days in the hospital cafeteria. Usually salads we didn't want, coffee we drank too fast. Jennifer was getting married in October, and I was going to be her maid of honor. We'd already picked out the dress, periwinkle blue. I thought I looked good in it. Work was exhausting but rewarding. The night shift paid an extra $3 an hour, and I needed that. I'd picked up extra hours over the past year, trying to build my savings for something I wasn't even sure about yet. Maybe a house. Maybe a fresh start somewhere. I didn't know, but I knew I wanted options. The ICU was my home. I'd worked there for 5 years straight. I knew every machine, every medication, every protocol. I could read a patient's blood work the way some people read faces. I could tell when someone was going downhill before the doctors could. That was my gift, I thought. That was what made me good. My manager, Linda, was fair and tough. She ran the night shift like a military operation. No shortcuts, no excuses. But she also had your back if you were solid, and I was solid. I never called in sick. I never made mistakes. I showed up early and left late. I cared about the people in those beds. Then came the week of March 15th. I remember because it was the day after Jennifer's bridal shower, and I was exhausted. The shower had been at a wine bar downtown, and I'd had too much Prosecco trying to be the fun maid of honor. I'd gotten home around midnight, and I had to be back at work by 9 p.m. for a 12-hour shift. I'd slept maybe 4 hours on the couch with my clothes still on. Work that night was chaos from the start. We had a patient in room 4, Richard Caldwell, 73 years old, admitted with pneumonia that had progressed to sepsis. He was intubated on a ventilator. His daughter had been there all day, frantic, holding his hand, asking questions we didn't have good answers to yet. By the time I came on shift, she'd finally gone home to sleep. Around midnight, I did my rounds. Richard was stable. Oxygen saturation 97%. Blood pressure a little low but acceptable. His breathing was synchronized with the ventilator. Everything looked fine. I documented it. I moved on. But here's the thing I didn't know yet. Richard's daughter, Carol, had called the hospital earlier that day, asking to speak to the night shift nurse. She'd left a message for Linda. Something about wanting to make sure her father was comfortable. Something about his wishes. I never got that message. Linda never mentioned it to me. Around 3:30 a.m., I was charting in the computer station when I heard the alarm, the ventilator alarm, the sound every ICU nurse dreads. I ran to room 4. Richard's oxygen saturation was dropping. 93, 90, 88. His face was pale. The ventilator display showed something was wrong with the circuit, either a kink in the tubing or something internal. This happens sometimes. It's usually fixable. I moved fast. I checked the tubing. No kink. I checked the connections. Everything was tight. I called for help. Another nurse, Marcus, came running. We repositioned him slightly. We checked the ventilator settings. Nothing was obviously wrong. But something was. Richard's saturation continued to drop. 85, 82. His heart rate was climbing. His blood pressure was falling. Marcus was on the phone with the respiratory therapist. I was standing there, my hands hovering over his body, knowing something was terribly wrong and not knowing what to do about it. And then Richard took a breath. His body relaxed. His oxygen saturation climbed back up. 93, 95, 97. Within 30 seconds, he was stable again. We stood there, breathing hard, looking at each other. "What the hell was that?" Marcus said. "I don't know," I said. "Maybe a temporary blockage in the tube? Maybe he moved wrong. I don't know." We called the doctor on call. Dr. Patterson came down and examined Richard. He looked at the ventilator readings, listened to Richard's lungs, and shrugged. "Everything looks fine now," he said. "His sats are good. Maybe he moved and kinked the tubing. Keep a close eye on him tonight, but I think we're okay." We all went back to what we were doing, and I documented it in the chart at 3:47 a.m. Patient breathing adequately, vitals stable, no distress noted. That wasn't a lie, not technically. He was breathing, his vitals were stable, there was no distress at that moment. But something about that documentation felt thin the moment I typed it. Something about the last 30 minutes felt wrong. I just didn't know how wrong yet. Richard died at 6:15 a.m., just before shift change, just before I could hand him off to the day shift nurse, Jennifer. She was the one who found him. She came into the room to take report and realized he wasn't breathing at all. Not fighting the ventilator, not breathing around it, just gone. The machines had stopped alarming because his body had stopped trying. I was already in my car driving home. My phone rang while I was on the highway. It was Linda. "Ashley, you need to come back. There's a situation." That's when everything started to come apart. I turned the car around before I'd even made it to the highway exit. My hands were shaking so badly I almost missed the turn back toward Riverside. Richard Caldwell was dead. Not sick, not declining, dead. And the last thing I documented was that he was breathing fine. I made it back to the hospital in 12 minutes. Linda was waiting for me in the ICU break room, her face tight and gray. Behind her sat two people I'd never seen before. A woman in her 50s with Carol Caldwell's exact nose, and a man in a dark suit holding a leather folder. "This is Carol's sister, Margaret," Linda said quietly. "And this is their attorney, Mr. Hoffman." The room tilted. Attorney. Not doctor. Not hospital administrator. Attorney. "Ms. Mitchell, I need to ask you some questions about your care of Mr. Caldwell last night," Hoffman said. He didn't stand up. He didn't offer his hand. "Specifically, I need to understand the incident that occurred around 3:30 a.m. "What incident?" I said. But I already knew. Marcus. Marcus had told them about the alarm, the oxygen drop, the moment we thought we were losing him. "The incident where my father's ventilator alarm went off," Margaret said. Her voice was sharp. "The incident where you and another nurse responded, and then apparently did nothing." "We checked everything," I said. "The tubing, the connections, the settings. The doctor came down. Everything was fine." Everything was fine, Hoffman repeated, writing something down. And yet, 6 hours later, he was dead. He had pneumonia that turned into sepsis, I said. He was 73 years old. He was stable, Margaret interrupted. The doctors told us he was stable. They said he'd turned a corner. And then you let him die. The words hit like a physical blow. Let him die. As if I'd made a choice. As if I'd stood there and decided to do nothing. I documented everything in the chart, I said. 3:47 a.m., patient breathing adequately. Vitals stable, no distress. Hoffman's eyes moved over me, like he was cataloging my weaknesses. Did you know that Carol left a message for the night shift nurse? She wanted to discuss her father's end-of-life wishes. I didn't answer. Did you receive that message? He asked. No, I said. Linda didn't tell me. Linda's face flushed. I was going to. I got pulled into a medication error in room 2. I forgot. Ashley, I'm sorry. I completely forgot to pass it along. So you had no idea that the family wanted to discuss allowing Mr. Caldwell to pass naturally if his condition deteriorated further, Hoffman continued. You had no context for his medical wishes. You simply documented that he was breathing and then left him unsupervised. I didn't leave him unsupervised, I said. We have monitors. Every patient is monitored continuously. Monitors that require interpretation, Hoffman said. Monitors that require a nurse to be present and alert and attentive. A nurse who, according to the hospital records, had worked a double shift the previous evening and was running on approximately 4 hours of sleep. How did he know that? How could he possibly know that? I was fine, I said. I was alert. Were you? Hoffman opened his folder. Inside was a printout from the hospital's time clock system. My badge swipes. 6:42 p.m. the day before. 12:01 a.m. that morning. No badge out. No break documented. 12 hours and 19 minutes with no documented break, followed immediately by a 12-hour night shift. And you expect us to believe you were at your best? I opened my mouth, closed it. He was right. I hadn't taken a break. I'd been tired, but I wasn't so tired that I couldn't do my job. I want to see his chart, I said. The full chart. Everything from when he was admitted. You have access to the chart, Hoffman said. We've already sent copies to the hospital's risk management department and to the state medical board. State medical board. The words echoed in my head like a gunshot. We're filing a complaint, Margaret said quietly. We're requesting a full investigation into your care of my father, and we're exploring whether the hospital is liable for negligence. They stood up. Linda tried to say something, but Hoffman just nodded at her dismissively. As they left, Margaret paused at the door and looked back at me. He called me that morning, she said, at 6 o'clock. He was supposed to call me every morning at 6. He didn't. The door closed. Linda sat down heavily in the chair across from me. Ashley, I'm so sorry. I should have told you about the message. This is my fault. No, I said. It's not. But I wasn't sure anymore what was fault and what was just terrible luck. I pulled up Richard's chart on my phone using the hospital's secure app. I scrolled through the entire admission. 73-year-old male, admitted with community-acquired pneumonia, progressing to sepsis. Intubated after respiratory failure. Initial assessment by Dr. Patterson at 4:15 p.m. Notes about his daughters visiting, about his stability, about his prognosis being guarded but not hopeless. And then there was the note from Dr. Patterson at 3:55 a.m., written after we called him about the alarm. Patient experienced brief desaturation event, likely secondary to positional change or tubing obstruction. Resolved spontaneously. No intervention required. Continue current management. We'll reassess in AM. Resolved spontaneously. That was the phrase that stuck in my head. It sounded clinical, routine. It sounded like nothing. But what if it wasn't nothing? What if that alarm meant something was already starting to fail? My phone buzzed. A text from my mom. Dinner this Sunday? Making pot roast. I didn't respond. By the time I left the hospital that morning, the story had already started changing. By the time I got home, it had changed again. By the time I turned on the local news that evening, the narrative had completely shifted from a sad family losing a loved one to a potential medical negligence case. The headline read, "Nurse under investigation in patient death at Riverside Medical Center." There was a photo of the hospital. There was no photo of me, but they had my name. They had my credentials. They had everything. Within 24 hours, I'd gone from being the nurse who cared too much to the nurse who'd killed someone. And the worst part? I started to believe it. I kept replaying that moment. 3:30 a.m., the alarm, Richard's oxygen dropping, the fear in Marcus's eyes. What if I'd missed something? What if I'd done something wrong? What if I'd been too tired to catch what was actually happening? The hospital suspended me pending investigation. Linda tried to advocate for me, but the administration had already lawyered up and shut down communication. My lawyer, a public defender type that the hospital's insurance recommended, told me to stop talking to anyone. Stop posting on social media. Stop thinking about the case publicly. The investigation will take months, he said. Just don't make it worse. Jennifer came to my apartment 3 days later with wine and takeout Thai food. She sat on my couch and looked at me with such pity that I wanted to scream. "Everyone at the hospital is talking about it," she said gently. "But most people don't think you did anything wrong. They know you. They know the kind of nurse you are." "The kind of nurse who let someone die," I said. "No," Jennifer said firmly. "The kind of nurse who was exhausted and got set up by a family looking for someone to blame." But I wasn't sure that's what had happened. Not anymore. The investigation dragged on. The state medical board sent me a formal notice requesting my full statement. Hoffman, the attorney representing the Caldwell family, filed a civil suit against me and the hospital. The hospital's insurance company assigned me a new lawyer, a tired woman named Susan who smelled like cigarettes and talked in clipped sentences. "Here's what we know," she said during one of our meetings in her office downtown. "The Caldwell family wants money. That's the bottom line. They're claiming negligence and emotional distress. They want the hospital to pay out, and they want your license suspended or revoked." "What do we tell them?" I asked. "We tell them that you followed protocol. You documented your findings. You called the doctor when there was a change in the patient's condition. You did your job correctly." But doubt was eating me alive. I went back to work after 3 weeks. The hospital had cleared me pending the investigation, but everyone knew I was under review. Patients asked for different nurses. My colleagues avoided me in the break room. Linda pulled me aside one day and told me that the hospital was going to be reducing my hours during the investigation. Reducing my hours, meaning I was being pushed out. I was sitting alone in the break room, eating a sad turkey sandwich and scrolling through my phone when I saw it. A comment on a Reddit post about medical negligence. Someone had linked to a medical journal article about ventilator management in septic patients. The article mentioned something called spontaneous tube obstruction, where a patient's secretions could partially block the ventilation tube, causing exactly the kind of desaturation event we'd experienced with Richard. I clicked through, I read the whole thing, and then I read the comments. One comment, posted by someone with the username resptherapist, said, "This is exactly what happened to a patient at our facility last year. The RN documented stable vitals after a brief DSAT event, and the patient coded 6 hours later. Turned out the tube was slowly getting blocked and nobody noticed because the SATs kept bouncing back. The RT should have been called to check the tube, not just the MD." RT, respiratory therapist. I'd never thought about the respiratory therapist. I'd called Dr. Patterson. The doctor had come down. He'd examined Richard. He'd said everything looked fine. But the respiratory therapist, the person trained specifically to manage ventilators, I'd never asked for them. Marcus came in during his shift that evening. I pulled him aside. "Do you remember that alarm with Richard Caldwell?" I asked. "Yeah," Marcus said. "That was rough." "Did you ever think about calling the RT?" Marcus paused. "I mean, you called the doctor. The doctor came down. He said Richard was fine." "But the doctor doesn't manage ventilators," I said. "The RT does." "Yeah, but we called him after the doctor cleared him. Don't you remember? The RT came by later and said everything looked good." I didn't remember. But I went back to my notes from that night, and there it was, in the chart at 4:15 a.m. RT called to assess ventilator function. Tube patent. Connections secure. Settings appropriate. No intervention required. The respiratory therapist had come. I'd just forgotten. Or maybe I documented it without really processing it. The RT had checked the tube and said it was fine. So it was fine, wasn't it? I pulled Richard's complete medical chart and started reading every note from the moment he was intubated. What I found made my stomach drop. The RT had documented a note at 11:45 p.m., just a few hours before the alarm, that said, "Increased secretion production noted. Patient suctioned. Monitor closely for obstruction." Increased secretions. Monitor closely. And then at 3:30 a.m., the alarm. The desaturation. The moment where I'd called the doctor instead of immediately calling back the person whose entire job was to manage that specific problem. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot and cried for 20 minutes straight. It wasn't that I'd done something wrong, it was that I'd done something incomplete. I'd responded to the immediate crisis, but I hadn't dug deeper. I hadn't asked the right questions. I'd let Dr. Patterson's reassurance become my own, and I'd moved on. And maybe, just maybe, if I'd called the RT back in right away, if I'd asked them to more thoroughly assess the tube given the note about increased secretions, Richard might still be alive. The next morning, I called Susan, my lawyer. "I need to tell you something," I said. "I think I know what happened to Richard Caldwell." Susan listened while I explained everything. The RT note about secretions. The pattern of brief desaturation followed by recovery. The possibility that the tube had been slowly getting blocked, and that the reason he coded 6 hours later was because the blockage finally became complete. "This is good," Susan said slowly. "This actually helps us. This shows that you responded appropriately to the crisis. It shows that you followed protocol by calling the doctor. But it also shows that maybe I should have called the RT back," I said. "Maybe I should have been more aggressive about getting the tube reassessed." "Maybe," Susan said, "but you didn't have the training or the expertise to make that call. That was the doctor's call, and he said to continue current management. So I'm not responsible?" "I didn't say that," Susan said. "I said you followed protocol. Whether you should have done more, that's something the investigation will determine." I hung up the phone and realized something had shifted inside me. I wasn't trying to save myself anymore. I was trying to understand what had really happened to Richard Caldwell, because the truth was the only thing that mattered now. I called the respiratory therapist who'd been on duty that night. His name was David Chen, and he'd been at Riverside for 8 years. We grabbed coffee at a place downtown, away from the hospital. "I need to ask you about Richard Caldwell," I said. David's face went pale. "I can't talk about that. My lawyer told me not to discuss anything related to the case." "I'm not asking you as a nurse," I said. "I'm asking you as someone who wants to understand what happened." David looked at me for a long moment. Then he stirred his coffee and started talking. "The tube was getting blocked," he said quietly. "I knew it was getting blocked. The secretions were building up. I noted it. I suctioned him. But the thing about septic patients is that they produce a lot of secretions, and sometimes the tube it happens. You can't always stop it. So when the alarm went off at 3:30, I started. That was the tube getting more blocked, David said. When you called the doctor and he came down, the patient had recovered because the body sometimes clears its own secretions. Coughing, moving, whatever. It temporarily relieves the pressure. But I knew it would happen again. Did you tell the doctor that? I asked. I told him I'd checked the tube, David said. I told him it was patent, but I didn't tell him I was concerned about progressive obstruction because... He trailed off. Because why? I pressed. Because Margaret Caldwell asked me not to, David said. The coffee shop seemed to get very quiet. What? I said. Margaret came to me around 2 a.m., David said. She was in the waiting room. She found me in the hallway and asked me point blank if her father was going to recover. I told her it was uncertain, and she said, if he does recover, he's going to be on a ventilator for months. He's going to be in a nursing home for the rest of his life. He told me he didn't want that. He told me if he got to this point, he wanted to go. I couldn't breathe. She asked me to stop monitoring the tube so aggressively, David continued. She didn't ask me to do anything active. She just asked me not to be as vigilant. She said it would be kinder. She said her father would want it that way. And you agreed? I said. I told her I couldn't do that, David said. I told her that if she wanted to discuss her father's code status or his end-of-life wishes, she needed to talk to the doctor. But then, he looked down at his coffee. Then I went on my break. I was supposed to be back at 3. I came back at 3:15. That's when the alarm went off. He'd been on break. He hadn't been there to prevent what happened. And maybe Margaret had known he wouldn't be there. You need to tell someone, I said. I can't, David said. I have a family. I have a mortgage. If I testify against the Caldwell family, they'll destroy me with countersuits. They'll claim I was negligent for taking a break at a critical time. They'll claim I was incompetent. They'll make sure I never work as an RT again. But you're letting me take the fall, I said. I'm sorry, David said, and he looked like he meant it. I'm really sorry, but I have to protect myself. He left money on the table for his coffee and walked out of the cafe. I sat there alone, holding the piece of the puzzle that could change everything. I could tell someone. I could give David's name to Susan. I could force him to testify. But he was right. They'd destroy him. And maybe he deserved it for not reporting what Margaret had asked him to do. But maybe he also deserved compassion, because he was trapped between his conscience and his survival, just like I was. That night, I did something I probably shouldn't have done. I called Carol Caldwell. She answered on the third ring. Who is this? It's Ashley Mitchell, I said. The nurse who was taking care of your father. There was silence. Then, I have nothing to say to you. I know, I said, but I have something to say to you. I'm sorry your father died. I'm sorry that I wasn't more aggressive in my assessment of his condition. But I also know that your sister asked our respiratory therapist to back off his monitoring. I know that your sister was hoping your father would deteriorate. That's not true, Carol said, but her voice wavered. It is true, I said, and I think you know it. I think you're grieving and you're angry and you need someone to blame. But the person you should be blaming isn't me. It's the hospital for not making sure all the doctors and nurses knew about your father's wishes. It's the system that didn't give your family a clear pathway to discuss what your father actually wanted. Carol was crying now. I could hear it in the silence. I think your father did want to go, I said gently. I think he was scared and in pain, and he didn't want to spend his last days on a ventilator. And maybe Margaret was trying to honor that in the only way she knew how. But that's not my fault, and it's not your fault. It's just, It's tragic. Carol hung up without responding. I didn't hear from her for 2 weeks. But then, in the middle of the night, I got an email from Hoffman. He was withdrawing the civil suit against me. The hospital was still facing potential liability, but the focus was shifting. The Caldwell family was requesting a review of the hospital's end-of-life care protocols. They were asking for policy changes, not financial compensation. It wasn't vindication. It was something quieter. It was a family admitting that maybe they'd been wrong about who was responsible for their father's death. The state medical board's investigation concluded 3 months later. Their finding? No evidence of misconduct or negligence on the part of Ms. Mitchell. The care provided was consistent with standard nursing practice and hospital protocol. But they also noted that the hospital's failure to communicate the patient's end-of-life wishes to all members of the care team may have contributed to suboptimal care decisions. The hospital revised its protocols. Every patient admitted to the ICU now has a mandatory family meeting within 24 hours to discuss goals of care. Every member of the care team, nurses, doctors, respiratory therapists, gets the same information about what the patient and family actually want. I got my hours back. My colleagues started treating me like a person again instead of a cautionary tale. But something had changed. I was still a good nurse, but I wasn't innocent anymore. I knew that good intentions weren't enough. I knew that exhaustion could make you miss things. I knew that the system was broken in ways that made people desperate enough to ask others to betray their oath. David Chen transferred to a different hospital system 3 states away. I never saw him again. Margaret Caldwell sent me a card once, a year after her father's death. It just said, "I'm sorry. I hope you can forgive me. I hope I can forgive myself." I framed it and hung it on my bedroom wall, next to a photo of my mom and me at Jennifer's wedding. Jennifer had married her fiancé the October after all of this happened. I was still her maid of honor. I wore the periwinkle dress and smiled for the photos, and nobody could tell that I'd spent the week before the wedding having panic attacks in my apartment. That was 3 years ago. I still work at Riverside. I still work the night shift, though now I take breaks and I sleep more. I still care about my patients. But I'm careful too. I ask the hard questions. I don't accept reassurance at face value. I call the respiratory therapist even when the doctor says everything is fine, because I learned that protocol is just the minimum. Excellence is asking one more question, pushing one more time, making sure that every voice in the room has been heard. Richard Caldwell wanted to go, but he was afraid to ask for it directly. His daughter Margaret tried to help him in the worst possible way. His daughter Carol wanted to save him when he'd already decided he was ready to leave. And I was caught in the middle, trying to do my job while everyone around me was drowning in grief and desperate choices. There was no villain in that story. There was just a system that failed to ask people what they actually wanted before it was too late.